1 second. That is all it takes to ruin your life. 1 slip of a finger, 1 moment of frustration, and 1 wrong number. We always think tragedies happen to other people, to characters in movies or headlines on the news. But for Sienna Brooks, the end of her normal life began on a rainy Tuesday in Chicago, with a glass of wine and a black lace corset. She thought she was sending a playful reminder to her negligent boyfriend. Instead, she sent a compromising photograph to Brian Moretti, the city's most dangerous man. She expected humiliation. She expected to be fired. But what happened the next day wasn't a firing squad. It was a proposition that would drag her into a world of blood, betrayal, and a desire dark enough to burn the city down. What do you do when the devil sees you bare and decides he wants to keep you? The rain battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and crimson. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive vanilla candles and the sharp metallic tang of ozone drifting in from the vents. Sienna Brooks sat on the edge of her plush velvet sofa, staring at the screen of her iPhone 15. The blue light illuminated a face that was usually composed and professional, the face of a rising junior architect at Sterling & Associates. But tonight, her expression was a fractured mosaic of insecurity and frustration. She took a long sip of Pinot Noir, the dark red liquid coating the back of her throat. It was her 3rd glass. "Pick up, Lucas," she whispered to the empty room. Lucas, her boyfriend of 2 years, had been distant lately. "Working late," he'd said for the 4th time this week. "Just corporate mergers, babe. You know how it is." Sienna wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the coldness seeping into their relationship was just a byproduct of the grind, the inevitable fatigue of 2 ambitious people trying to make it in a city that never slept. But the silence in the apartment was deafening. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a new set of lingerie she'd bought from a boutique on Michigan Avenue. Black lace, intricately woven, with sheer paneling that hugged her curves in a way that felt both empowering and incredibly vulnerable. She had bought it to surprise him. She had prepped dinner, a saffron risotto that was now congealing in the pot on the stove, and waited. And waited. It was now 11:45 p.m. Frustration, hot and prickly, began to override her sadness. If he wasn't coming home to see this, she would make him regret missing it. She would make him think about what he was ignoring while he pushed papers at his desk. Sienna stood up and walked to the full-length mirror in the hallway. The lighting here was dimmer, moody. She posed, arching her back slightly, letting her dark hair cascade over one shoulder. She snapped 3 photos. The first was too blurry. The second was too revealing. The third was perfect. Mysterious, alluring, capturing the curve of her waist and the defiant look in her eyes. It was a promise and a threat all in one. She opened her messaging app. Her thumb hovered over the contact list. The wine made her movements slightly sluggish, her focus hazy. She typed Dom into the search bar. That was her pet name for Lucas. Brian was his middle name, and she used it when she was being playful or stern. A contact popped up. Brian M. Without a second thought, she attached the photo. She didn't add a caption. The image spoke for itself. Sent. The little whoosh sound of the message delivering felt like a gavel banging down. Sienna tossed the phone onto the cushion beside her and exhaled, a mix of adrenaline and pettiness swirling in her chest. That would wake him up. That would get a reaction. She went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water, trying to sober up before bed. She washed the wine glass, dried her hands, and walked back to the living room. Her phone buzzed. A reply. Already? That was fast. Maybe he wasn't as busy as he claimed. She picked up the phone, a smirk playing on her lips. She unlocked the screen. The message wasn't from Lucas, it was from Brian M. But as her eyes focused on the previous chat history with this contact, the blood drained from her face so fast it left her dizzy. There were no heart emojis, no "good morning, babe" texts. The previous messages were formal, curt, and terrifyingly professional. Ms. Brooks, the blueprints for the West Loop project are due Thursday. Ensure the security schematics are updated. I do not tolerate delays. Sienna stopped breathing. The glass of water slipped from her hand, bouncing off the rug and spilling onto the hardwood floor. But she didn't hear it. Brian M. wasn't Lucas Bryan. Brian M. was Brian Moretti. Brian Moretti was not just her firm's biggest, most secretive client. He was a man whose name was whispered in Chicago with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was a venture capitalist on paper, but everyone in the architectural firm knew the rumors. The Moretti family owned half the construction unions in the city. They owned the shipping yards. They owned the politicians. Sienna had met him exactly 3 times. Each time, he had been wearing a 3-piece suit that cost more than her car, and he had looked at her with eyes like shattered ice, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. He was a man who didn't smile, a man who likely had people killed for disrespecting him, and she had just sent him a photo of herself in black lace lingerie. Her hands shook violently as she scrambled to tap the screen. Delete. Unsend. Remove for everyone. The option wasn't there. The message was marked, "Read." He had seen it. The most dangerous man in Chicago had seen her half naked. Sienna stared at the reply he had sent. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a rebuke. It was 3 simple words that terrified her, more than any threat of violence could have. "Nice lighting, Sienna." Sienna dropped the phone as if it were burning hot. She backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the corner of her sofa, wrapped in a thick robe, staring at the door, half expecting it to be kicked in. She had just propositioned a mafia don. In her industry, you didn't just get fired for unprofessionalism with a client like Moretti. You disappeared. The morning sun over Chicago was grey and unforgiving, matching the colour of Sienna's complexion. She had showered 3 times, scrubbing her skin raw, as if she could wash away the memory of the night before. She dressed in her most conservative outfit, a high-collared charcoal blouse, wide-leg trousers, and a blazer that seemed 2 sizes too big for her shrinking confidence. She considered calling in sick. She considered packing a bag and driving to her sister's place in Wisconsin. But running would look guilty. Running would make it seem like she had done it on purpose, a desperate attempt to seduce a wealthy client. No, she had to face this. She had to go in, apologize profusely, claim her phone was hacked, or that she was sleepwalking. Any lie was better than the truth. The commute on the L train was a blur of noise and anxiety. Every time a man in a dark coat looked at her, she flinched. Paranoia was a cold snake coiling around her throat. When she arrived at Sterling and Associates, the atmosphere was normal. The receptionist, Brenda, was typing away. The coffee machine was whirring. No one pointed at her. No one screamed. Sienna made it to her cubicle, her knees weak. She sat down and booted up her computer, her eyes darting toward the glass-walled office of the senior partner, Mr. Henderson. If Moretti had called, Henderson would be the first to know. 10 a.m. passed, nothing. 11 a.m., still nothing. Sienna began to feel a tiny, fragile thread of hope. Maybe Moretti had just laughed it off. Maybe a man with his power saw this kind of thing all the time and simply didn't care enough to ruin a junior architect's life over it. Then, at 11:45 a.m., exactly 12 hours after she sent the photo, the elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open with a heavy ding. The chatter in the office died instantly. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was the sudden, suffocating silence of a predator entering a clearing. 2 men stepped out first. They were massive, wearing dark suits that strained against their shoulders, earpieces coiled behind their ears. They scanned the room, their gazes professional and lethal. Then, Brian Moretti walked out. He was taller than Sienna remembered. He wore a midnight blue bespoke suit, the fabric absorbing the light. His dark hair was swept back, severe and neat. But it was his presence that sucked the air out of the room. He didn't walk. He glided, with the predatory grace of a panther patrolling its territory. Mr. Henderson rushed out of his office, his face pale, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Moretti, we weren't expecting you until next week for the site review." Brian didn't look at him. His eyes, dark and impenetrable, were scanning the rows of cubicles. He was looking for something, or someone. Sienna slid down in her chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. "Please don't see me. Please don't see me." "I'm not here for the site review, Henderson," Brian said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth as velvet wrapped around a razor blade. It carried effortlessly across the silent office. "I had a sudden adjustment to my schedule. I realized I needed to personally oversee the restoration details on the penthouse." Of course," Henderson stammered. "Sienna is the lead on the restoration details. I can call her into the conference room." "No need," Brian interrupted. He began to walk down the aisle between the desks. His polished Oxfords clicked rhythmically against the floor. Click, click, click. The sound grew louder as he approached Sienna's row. Sienna held her breath, staring at her computer screen, pretending to study a CAD drawing of a ventilation shaft. The footsteps stopped. A shadow fell over her desk. The scent of expensive sandalwood, tobacco, and something colder, like rain on pavement, filled her nose. Sienna slowly looked up. Brian Moretti was towering over her. Up close, he was devastatingly handsome, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and a small scar interrupting his left eyebrow that hinted at a violent past. He wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes, those terrifying eyes, were locked onto hers. They burned with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Ms. Brooks?" he said softly. Mr. Moretti," Sienna managed to squeak. Her throat felt like sandpaper. He placed a hand on her desk, leaning in slightly. The office watched with bated breath. Everyone knew Brian Moretti did not chat with junior staff. "I received your proposal last night," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, but the weight of the words crashed into her like a freight train. Sienna's face flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. "Mr. Moretti, I can explain. It was a terrible mistake. I was trying to send it to—" He held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm not interested in explanations, Sienna. I'm interested in results." He straightened up, adjusting his cufflinks. He turned to Mr. Henderson, who was hovering nervously a few feet away. "Henderson," Brian barked. "Yes, sir?" "Pack Miss Brooks's things." Sienna's heart stopped. This was it. She was being fired. "Sir?" Henderson asked, confused. "I said pack her things," Brian repeated calmly, though the threat in his tone was undeniable. "She is no longer working here." I don't understand," Henderson stuttered. "She's been reassigned," Brian said, his eyes sliding back to Sienna, pinning her to the chair. I require a dedicated consultant for the penthouse project. Someone available 24/7. Someone who understands aesthetics." He looked at Sienna, his gaze dropping to her neckline for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "Sienna will be working from my private estate, starting immediately." The room gasped. Sienna's mouth fell open. Working from his estate? That wasn't a job offer. That was a kidnapping with a payroll. I can't," Sienna whispered, panic rising in her chest. "I have a life here. I can't just—" Brian leaned in again, his lips inches from her ear. "You sent a photo to the capo of the Chicago outfit, Sienna. You have two choices. You walk out of here with me, under my protection, and we discuss how you're going to repay that indiscretion. Or—" He paused, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Or you stay here, and I let my associates wonder why you were trying to seduce me. They can get very jealous on my behalf." He pulled back, his face blank again. He extended a hand toward her. It was large, calloused, and demanding. "Grab your bag, Sienna. The car is waiting." Sienna looked at his hand, then at the terrified faces of her co-workers. She realized then that she had no choice. The mistake she made last night hadn't just embarrassed her. It had transferred ownership of her life. She reached out, her hand trembling, and placed it in his. His grip was warm and firm, like a steel trap snapping shut. "Good girl," he murmured. As he led her out of the office, past the stunned receptionist and the security guards, Sienna's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it, but if she had, she would have seen a text from Lucas. "Lucas, hey babe, sorry I missed you last night. Crazy work. Dinner tonight?" It was too late. Sienna was already walking into the lion's den, and the door was locking behind her. The ride from the bustling streets of the Loop to the outskirts of the city was a study in suffocating silence. Brian Moretti's car was a custom-armored Mercedes-Maybach S-Class, a vehicle that felt less like a car and more like a rolling bank vault. The leather seats were cool against Sienna's feverish skin, and the tinted windows turned the sunny Chicago afternoon into a perpetual twilight. Sienna sat pressed against the door, clutching her purse as if it contained the last remnants of her sanity. Beside her, Brian was working. He hadn't looked at her since they left the office. He was typing on a tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration, the earlier heat of his gaze replaced by a terrifyingly cold efficiency. It was as if she were just another asset he had acquired, a piece of property to be transported and stored. "Where are we going?" Sienna asked. Her voice sounded thin and brittle in the soundproofed cabin. Brian didn't look up. "North. Lake Forest." "Lake Forest is an hour away," she argued, a spark of indignation cutting through her fear. "My dog needs to be walked. My sister calls me every Tuesday at 6. You can't just take me." Brian's finger paused over the screen. He slowly turned his head. The movement was predatory, deliberate. "Your dog will be collected by my staff. Your sister will be told you are on an urgent assignment for the firm with a strict NDA. Everything is handled. You can't control my life," she snapped, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "Sienna," he said, his voice dropping to that velvet-over-gravel tone that made her stomach flip. "I own the building you live in. I sit on the board of the bank that holds your student loans. And as of 40 minutes ago, I am your sole employer. Control isn't something I take. It is the natural state of my existence." He went back to his tablet. "Besides, you should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" She let out a hysterical laugh. "For kidnapping me because of a photo. Because of a breach in protocol," he corrected sharply. "Do you think you are the first woman to try to get my attention? Do you think I don't have firewalls, filters, and secretaries to screen my messages? But you bypassed them. You have my private number, the one only my family and my consigliere have." He looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. "That number is encrypted. It doesn't exist in the public directory. So the question, Miss Brooks, isn't why you sent the photo. The question is how you got the number to send it to in the first place." Sienna blinked, confused. I told you. I typed Dom. It must have auto-synced from the firm's database when I worked on the initial West Loop pitch." "The firm doesn't have this number," Brian stated flatly, "which means someone gave it to you, or someone planted it on your phone." The car began to slow down. They had turned off the main highway and were winding down a narrow, tree-lined road that screamed old money. The trees here were ancient oaks, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dark tunnel. "We're here," Brian announced. Sienna looked out the window and gasped. She was an architect. She appreciated design, scale, and structure. But the estate looming before her wasn't just a house. It was a fortress disguised as a French Renaissance chateau. 12-foot iron gates, reinforced with steel mesh, swung open silently as the car approached. A guard booth, manned by 2 men with assault rifles slung openly across their chests, stood at the entrance. They nodded respectfully as the Maybach rolled through. The driveway was a quarter-mile of crushed white limestone, winding through manicured lawns that looked like they were cut with scissors. The house itself was massive, grey stone, slate roof, turrets, and imposing chimneys. But Sienna's trained eye saw the details others might miss. The surveillance cameras disguised as gargoyles, the bulletproof thickness of the window glass, the perimeter sensors lining the flower beds. This wasn't a home. It was a bunker for a king. The car stopped in front of the grand entrance. The driver, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, opened the door. Brian stepped out and buttoned his jacket. He didn't wait for her. He walked toward the massive oak doors, assuming she would follow. Sienna hesitated. The open air smelled of pine and Lake Michigan, offering a tantalizing tease of freedom. She could run. But where? The gates were closed, the guards were armed, and she was in heels. She stepped out of the car, her legs wobbling. "Mr. Moretti, please," she pleaded, as she caught up to him on the stone steps. "I'm just an architect. I don't know anything about encryption or private numbers. I just wanted to make my boyfriend jealous." Brian stopped with his hand on the brass door handle. He turned to face her, towering over her petite frame. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the harsh angles of his cheekbones. "Boyfriend," he repeated, the word tasting sour in his mouth. "Lucas, right?" Sienna's eyes widened. "How do you know his name?" "I know everything, Sienna. I know Lucas works in mid-level management for a logistics company. I know he has a gambling debt of $45,000 spread across 3 bookies in Southside. And I know he hasn't been working late for the past 3 months." Sienna felt like she had been punched in the gut. "What?" Brian's expression softened, just a fraction. Not with kindness, but with a strange, dark pity. "He's been seeing a waitress from a cocktail bar on Wacker Drive. He's not worthy of the photo you sent, Sienna. He's certainly not worth dying for." "Dying?" she whispered. Brian pushed the door open. "Welcome to my home. Wipe your feet. We have a lot of work to do." The interior was even more intimidating than the exterior. The foyer was a cavern of black marble and gold leaf. A dual staircase swept up to a gallery landing, lit by a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than Sienna's entire education. But it was the silence that unnerved her. The house was huge, yet it felt empty. Strip, Brian said calmly. Sienna froze, clutching her blazer. "Excuse me?" Brian sighed, clearly annoyed by her slowness. He turned and snapped his fingers. A middle-aged woman in a severe black housekeeper's uniform appeared from a side door. "Mrs. DeLuca will take your clothes to be incinerated," Brian said, checking his watch. "You are wearing a wire, a tracker, or your phone is compromised. I don't take risks. She has prepared a wardrobe for you in the East Wing." "Incinerated?" Sienna shrieked. "This is a vintage Armani blazer." "I'll buy you 10 new ones," Brian dismissed, walking toward a set of double doors. "Give Mrs. DeLuca your phone, your watch, and your clothes. Shower. Then meet me in the library. Second door on the left." "And if I refuse?" Sienna challenged, finding a reserve of courage she didn't know she had. Brian stopped. He didn't turn around. "Then I open the front gate, and you can walk back to Chicago. But I should warn you, the men looking for the person who leaked my number are not as polite as I am. They don't want to talk to you, Sienna. They want to erase you." He stepped through the doors and closed them behind him. Sienna stood shivering in the foyer, the cold marble seeping through the soles of her shoes. Mrs. DeLuca held out a plastic bin, her face expressionless. "The phone first, miss," the housekeeper said. Sienna handed over her phone. It felt like severing a limb. As she watched it drop into the bin, she realized the terrifying truth. Sienna Brooks, the architect, no longer existed. She was now a ghost in Brian Moretti's machine. An hour later, Sienna stood in front of the heavy mahogany doors of the library. She felt cleaner, but more exposed than ever. Mrs. DeLuca had provided her with appropriate attire, which turned out to be a simple silk slip dress in a soft champagne color. It was elegant, expensive, and clearly belonged to a woman who didn't do manual labor. It clung to her curves, reminding her of the photo that had started this entire nightmare. She knocked. "Enter." She pushed the door open. The library was a masterpiece of dark academia. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a rolling ladder, and a massive fireplace where a log crackled, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rug. The smell of old paper, brandy, and cigar smoke hung heavy in the air. Brian was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening grounds. He had removed his jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and inked with faint, faded tattoos that looked like prison markings. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand. "Drink?" he offered, not turning around. "I want to go home," Sienna said, remaining by the door. "Scotch it is." He poured a second glass and turned, walking toward her. He extended the glass. Sienna took it, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt of electricity zipped up her arm, startling her. She saw his eyes flicker. He felt it too. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a leather wingback chair in front of his desk. Sienna sat, taking a large gulp of the scotch. It burned, but it settled her nerves. Brian sat on the edge of his massive oak desk, looming over her. "We need to establish the narrative." "The narrative?" "For why you are here," he explained. "To the outside world, you are my new live-in architectural consultant for the estate renovation. To my staff, you are a guest under my protection. To my enemies," his jaw tightened. "To my enemies, you are my mistress." Sienna choked on her drink. "Your what?" "It's the only cover that explains why I would bring a civilian into the compound so abruptly," Brian said pragmatically. "If they think you are important to me romantically, they will hesitate to strike immediately. They will want to use you as leverage." "That makes me a target," Sienna cried out. "It makes you valuable," Brian corrected. "Valuable things are kept alive. Useless things are discarded. He stood up and walked around the desk, pulling out a file folder. He tossed it onto the desk in front of her. "Open it." Sienna hesitated, then opened the folder. It was a dossier. On her. There were photos of her walking her dog, photos of her at the gym, photos of her buying the lingerie yesterday. And then there was a transcript of her text messages going back 6 months. You spied on me?" She looked up at him in horror. "I vetted you." "In the last 3 hours," Brian said, "and I found something interesting." He leaned over, placing both hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her. His face was inches from hers. She could smell the scotch on his breath and the clean, masculine scent of his skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, fear mixed with a sudden, confusing spike of arousal. "Your boyfriend, Lucas," Brian murmured, his eyes searching hers. "He didn't just have gambling debts. He was selling information about your firm's clients to pay them off. He sold the security blueprints of the West Loop Bank project to a rival crew." Sienna gasped. "No, Lucas wouldn't." "He did. And when he found out you had access to my contact info through the old database glitch, he was planning to sell that too. He was going to sell my private line to the Russian mob in Chicago." Brian's voice dropped to a whisper. "But you beat him to it. You sent that photo. You triggered my security algorithms before he could sell the number. In a way, your vanity saved my life." Sienna stared at him, her world tilting on its axis. I saved you?" "You alerted me," he corrected. "But now, the Russians think you are the broker. They think you are the one holding the keys to my kingdom. They intercepted the metadata of the message before I wiped it. They know a photo was sent. They don't know it was a nude. They think it was a code." He reached out, his thumb grazing her lower lip. The touch was rough, possessive. Sienna stopped breathing. "So you see, Sienna," Brian said, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "You can't go home. If you leave this estate, you will be snatched off the street within an hour. They will torture you for codes you don't have." Tears welled up in her eyes. "So I'm a prisoner." "You are a guest," he said firmly. "And you will play the part. You will live here. You will eat with me. You will sleep in the room next to mine." "And the mistress part?" she challenged, her voice trembling. "Is that just for show too?" Brian stared at her for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. He looked at the pulse fluttering in her neck, the curve of her breast in the silk dress, the fire in her eyes. "That depends," he said softly. "On what?" "On how good of an actor you are." He pushed himself away from the chair, breaking the spell. "Dinner is at 8. Do not be late. I hate cold food." He turned his back to her, dismissing her. Sienna scrambled out of the chair, grabbing the dossier. She ran out of the library, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She didn't stop until she reached the room assigned to her in the East Wing. She slammed the door and leaned against it, gasping for air. She looked at the dossier in her hand. She looked at the luxurious cage she was trapped in. Lucas was a traitor. The Russians wanted her, and Brian Moretti. She touched her lip where his thumb had grazed. It still burned. She walked to the window and looked out at the grounds. Night had fallen. Down by the gate, she saw the headlights of a car turning around. But beyond the gate, in the shadows of the tree line, she saw something else. A flash of light. A reflection. Someone was watching the house. Her phone was gone. Her life was gone. But as she looked at the reflection in the glass, Sienna straightened her spine. She had accidentally invited the devil into her life. But if she was going to survive in hell, she couldn't just be a victim. She had to become the queen. She walked to the closet and threw open the doors. If she had to play the mistress, she would play it so well that even Brian Moretti wouldn't know where the act ended and the reality began. She pulled out a dress, red, backless, dangerous. "Dinner at 8, she whispered to the empty room. "Game on, Brian." The dining room of the Moretti estate was designed to intimidate. A 20-foot table made of dark walnut stretched down the center, lit by candelabras that dripped wax like tears. At the far end, Brian sat alone, scrolling through his phone, a glass of dark red wine untouched beside him. He looked up when he heard the click of heels on the parquet floor. For the first time in years, Brian Moretti, a man who had stared down federal judges and rival hitmen without blinking, lost his train of thought. Sienna stood in the archway. The red dress was a weapon. It was silk, the color of fresh arterial blood, held up by thin spaghetti straps that crossed over her bare back. It hugged her waist and flowed to the floor, with a slit that rose dangerously high on her thigh. She had pulled her dark hair back into a severe, elegant bun, exposing the vulnerable curve of her neck. She didn't look like a scared architect anymore. She looked like the lady of the manor. "You're late," Brian said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. He stood up, a gesture of respect he hadn't intended to make. "I had to find the right shoes," Sienna replied coolly, walking toward him. She took the seat to his right, not the one at the opposite end of the table. She was closing the distance. Brian signaled to the shadows, and a server appeared to pour her wine. "You adapt quickly," Brian observed, sitting back down. His eyes tracked her every movement. Most civilians would still be crying in their room. "I did my crying," Sienna said, taking a sip of the wine. It was rich, oaky, and expensive. "But you said I have a role to play. If I'm going to be the mistress of a mob boss, I can't look like a victim. Victims get eaten." Brian's lips curved into a ghost of a smile. "True. But be careful, Sienna. The role is dangerous. If you play it too well, you might forget who you really are." "Who am I, Brian?" she challenged, leaning forward, the candlelight dancing in her eyes. "Yesterday, I was a girl waiting for a boyfriend who was cheating on me. Today, I'm the target of the Russian mob. I don't think I know who I am anymore." Brian reached out, his hand covering hers on the table. His skin was rough, warm, and electric. "You are safe. As long as you are in this house, nothing touches you." "Is that a promise?" "That is a fact." Just then, a sharp crack echoed through the room. It sounded like a dry branch snapping, but louder. Instantaneously, the crystal wine glass in Sienna's hand exploded. Shards of glass and red wine sprayed across her chest and face. For a split second, there was silence. Sienna stared at her empty hand, her brain unable to process what had happened. Then, Brian was moving. "Get down!" he roared. He launched himself out of his chair, tackling Sienna to the floor. The heavy wood of the chair clattered as it tipped over. Another crack whipped through the air, and a bullet decimated the antique vase on the mantelpiece behind where Sienna's head had been a second ago. "Sniper!" Brian yelled into his lapel microphone. "Northridge, sectors 4 and 5. Sienna was pressed into the Persian rug, Brian's heavy body shielding her completely. She could smell the starch of his shirt and the metallic tang of fear. The red wine soaked into her dress, looking terrifyingly like blood. "Are you hit?" he demanded, gripping her face with urgent hands. His eyes were wild, scanning her for wounds. I don't know," she gasped, trembling violently. "The glass. Stay down. Do not move." The room erupted into chaos. The double doors burst open, and 3 men with automatic rifles swarmed in. One of them was Matteo, Brian's head of security. "They're in the tree line, boss! We're returning fire!" Matteo shouted. "Get us to the vault!" Brian commanded. He scooped Sienna up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "I can walk," she cried, though her legs felt like jelly. "Not fast enough," he growled. He ran with her, moving through the hallways with terrifying speed. Sienna buried her face in his neck, squeezing her eyes shut as the sound of distant gunfire popped like firecrackers outside. The illusion of the safe, impenetrable fortress had shattered along with her wine glass. They reached the library. Brian kicked a hidden panel under the bookshelf, and a section of the wall hissed open, revealing a steel door. He punched in a code, the keypad beeping rapidly. The door swung open, revealing a stairwell bathed in red emergency light. He carried her down, the heavy steel door sealing shut behind them with a definitive thud, cutting off the noise of the outside world. They were safe. But as Brian set her down on the cold, concrete floor of the panic room, Sienna saw the sleeve of his white shirt was torn, and it was soaked in real blood. The panic room was more like a luxury apartment built for the apocalypse. It had a leather couch, a kitchenette, a wall of monitors, and a rack of weapons that looked like they belonged in a war movie. But the air was recycled and stale, humming with the sound of oxygen scrubbers. Sienna backed away until her legs hit the couch. Then she collapsed onto it. Her chest was heaving. She looked at Brian. He was pacing, ripping off his tie and unbuttoning his shirt. "You're bleeding," she whispered. Brian glanced at his left arm. A jagged cut ran from his shoulder to his bicep. "Glass shard. From the window. It's superficial." "It's deep, Brian," she said, her architect's eye for detail kicking in despite the shock. "You need stitches." "I've had worse from shaving," he dismissed, walking to the gun rack. He pulled down a black tactical vest and began to strap it on over his ruined shirt. "Matteo will clear the perimeter. But this—" He paused, his jaw tightening. This was precise. They knew exactly where we were sitting. They knew the layout of the dining room. He turned to her, his eyes dark with fury. "There is a leak inside the house." Sienna shivered, hugging her arms around herself. The wine was sticky on her skin. "Lucas?" "Lucas gave them the blueprints," Brian said, loading a magazine into a handgun with a sharp click. "But someone inside told them when we sat down for dinner. Someone told them the drapes were open." He walked over to a medical kit mounted on the wall, grabbed a bottle of antiseptic and a roll of gauze, and tossed them onto the coffee table in front of her. "Clean yourself up," he said gruffly. "You have wine all over you." Sienna looked at the bottle, then at him. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, hard anger. She stood up, grabbed the antiseptic, and walked over to him. "Sit down," she ordered. Brian looked at her, surprised. "I told you it's fine." "Sit down." Her voice didn't waver. "You saved my life. Let me fix your arm." Brian hesitated, then slowly sat on the edge of the metal desk. Sienna stepped between his spread knees. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her touch was gentle as she peeled back the torn fabric of his shirt. The wound was ugly, a slice through the muscle. She poured the antiseptic on a cloth. "This is going to sting. Do it." She pressed the cloth to the wound. Brian hissed through his teeth, his muscles bunching under her hands, but he didn't pull away. For a moment, there was no sound but the hum of the ventilation and their breathing. Sienna worked methodically, cleaning the blood, applying butterfly strips to close the gash, and wrapping it in gauze. She was close to him, so close she could feel the heat radiating off his chest. "Why?" she asked softly, not looking at his face. "Why do you live like this, looking over your shoulder, eating dinner behind bulletproof glass that apparently isn't bulletproof enough?" Brian looked down at the top of her head. He could smell the vanilla of her shampoo beneath the scent of wine and gunpowder. "Because I was born into it," he said, his voice low. "My father built this empire. He built it on bones and bribes. When he died, I had two choices. Let it crumble and watch my family get slaughtered by the wolves waiting at the gate, or become the biggest wolf of them all." Sienna finished tying the bandage. She looked up, her face inches from his. "And are you? The biggest wolf?" Brian stared at her. The adrenaline of the attack was mixing with something else, something primal that had sparked the moment he saw her in that red dress. "I have to be," he murmured, "especially now." He reached up, his hand cupping the back of her neck. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. It wasn't a threatening touch this time. It was an anchor. "Sienna," he breathed. The air between them crackled. It would be so easy to kiss him. It would be insane, reckless, and stupid. But God, she wanted to. The danger had stripped away the social niceties. There was only survival, and the magnetic pull of the man who had just used his body as a human shield for her. She leaned in, her eyes fluttering shut. The intercom on the wall buzzed loudly, shattering the moment. Sienna jumped back, her face flushing. Brian closed his eyes for a second, a look of pained frustration crossing his face, before he pressed the button. "Report," he barked. Matteo's voice crackled through the speaker. "Boss, we cleared the ridge. The shooter is gone. But we found something. A burner phone dropped in the grass. And it has one outgoing text sent 2 minutes before the shot. It says, 'Target acquired. The girl is in red.'" Brian's eyes met Sienna's. "The girl is in red." "Who received the text, Matteo?" "We traced it, boss. It went to a number registered to a shell company in the Caymans. But the GPS ping of the receiver," Matteo paused. "The receiver is moving. It's heading towards the south side warehouses. And boss, we got a hit on Lucas's credit card. He just bought gas 3 miles from here." Brian slammed his fist onto the metal desk. "He's not just the rat. He's the guide." He looked at Sienna. The softness was gone from his face, replaced by the mask of the Don. "They aren't just trying to kill me, Sienna. They are trying to take you. They think you have the codes, and Lucas is leading them right to the front door." "But we're safe in here, right?" Sienna asked, her voice trembling. "For now. But a bunker is just a tomb with a lock on the inside. If they lay siege to the estate, we're trapped." Brian stood up, grabbing an assault rifle from the rack and checking the sights. He tossed a heavy Kevlar jacket at Sienna. "Put this on. Over the dress." "Where are we going?" "We're not staying here to be sitting ducks," Brian said, a cold, ruthless light entering his eyes. "Lucas thinks he knows where I live. He thinks he knows how I fight. But he forgot one thing." "What?" "I don't hide." Brian walked to the door and punched in the code to unlock it. "We're leaving the estate. We're going to the south side. If Lucas is leading the Russians, then I'm going to introduce them to the Chicago way of doing business." He held out his hand to her. "Are you with me, Sienna? Or do you want to stay in the box and wait for them to cut through the door?" Sienna looked at the heavy steel door, then at Brian. He was terrifying, violent, and dangerous. But he was the only thing standing between her and a torture chamber. She grabbed the Kevlar jacket, pulled it on over her ruined red dress, and took his hand. "Let's go get the bastard," she said. Brian smirked, a genuine feral grin. "That's my girl." The industrial district of Chicago's South Side was a graveyard of rusted steel and broken glass. Fog rolled off the canal, obscuring the hulking shapes of abandoned warehouses. It was here, in the shadow of the old ironworks, a place historically whispered about in connection to the ghosts of the Al Capone era, that Lucas had arranged the meet. Brian pulled the Maybach into a shadowed alleyway 3 blocks down. He killed the engine. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant wail of a train horn. "Stay here," Brian said, checking the magazine of his pistol one last time. "Mateo has teams flanking the east and west exits. I'm going in the front." Sienna looked at him. She was still wearing the Kevlar vest over her ruined red dress, her hair escaping its bun in wild strands. She didn't look like a civilian anymore. She looked like a survivor. "No," she said. Brian paused, his hand on the door handle. "Excuse me." "Lucas won't show his face if he sees you," Sienna said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "He thinks he's meeting the Russian contact to hand over the codes. If you walk in there, he'll run, and we'll lose him in the rail yards. He needs to see me." "Absolutely not," Brian growled. "You are not bait." "I'm already the bait, Brian. That's the whole point." She reached out and grabbed his arm. "He betrayed me. He sold me out for gambling money. I need to look him in the eye. I need to know he knows he lost." Brian stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had intrigued him from that very first photo. She wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a tactical fact. "You have 5 minutes," Brian said, his voice tight. "I'll be in the shadows. If he touches you, if he even breathes wrong, I take the shot. Do you understand?" "I understand." Sienna opened the door and stepped out into the cold, damp night. She walked down the center of the cracked pavement toward the warehouse with the peeling blue paint. Her heels clicked echoing rhythms against the concrete. She felt terrified, yes, but beneath the fear was a simmering rage that kept her spine straight. She pushed open the rusted side door of the warehouse. The interior was vast, smelling of oil and rot. In the center of the open floor, illuminated by a single hanging work light, stood a folding table. Lucas was there. He looked terrible. His suit was rumpled, his tie loose, and he was pacing nervously. When he heard the door open, he spun around, a look of relief washing over his sweaty face. "Sienna!" he cried out, taking a step toward her. "Oh, thank God. I told them you'd come. I told them you were smart." Sienna stopped 10 feet away. She didn't smile. "Hello, Lucas." "Babe, listen, we have to make this quick," Lucas stammered, his eyes darting to the shadows. "The Russians, they're intense. But I made a deal. I told them you have the encryption keys for Moretti's accounts. Just give them the numbers and they'll let us go. We can take the money and go to Cabo. Just you and me." Sienna laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound that echoed off the metal rafters. "Cabo? You sold my life for 45 grand, Lucas. Do you really think there's a you and me left?" Lucas's face hardened. "You don't understand. I did this for us. I needed to get out from under the debt. And Moretti, he's a monster, Sienna. I'm saving you from him." "You're not saving me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're selling me." "Give me the codes, Sienna," Lucas shouted, stepping forward aggressively. "Stop playing games." "She doesn't have the codes, Lucas." The voice came from the darkness behind the crates, deep, calm, and terrifying. Lucas froze. "Who's there?" Brian stepped into the circle of light. He moved with a lazy, lethal grace, his gun hanging loosely at his side. He didn't look at Lucas. He kept his eyes on the catwalks above them. "You brought a guest?" A thick, accented voice boomed from the upper level. From the shadows of the catwalk, 3 men emerged, training AK-47s on the floor below. The leader, a man with a scarred neck known as Voronin, leaned over the railing. "Mr. Moretti," Voronin sneered. "So kind of you to deliver yourself." Lucas looked between the Russians and Brian, panic rising in his chest. "Wait, this wasn't the deal. You said no violence if I brought the girl. Shut up, you worm," Voronin spat. He looked at Brian. "Drop the gun, Moretti, or the girl dies first." Brian looked at Sienna. He gave her a microscopic nod. "Drop." Sienna threw herself to the ground, just as Brian raised his weapon. The warehouse exploded in noise. Brian didn't drop his gun. He fired. 2 shots in rapid succession, not at the men, but at the chain holding the massive industrial worklight above the catwalk. The chain snapped. The heavy light fixture swung down like a wrecking ball, smashing into the catwalk railing and sending Voronin toppling over the edge with a scream. "Now!" Brian roared. From the skylights above, glass shattered as Matteo and his team rappelled down, opening fire on the remaining Russians. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of gunfire and shouting. Lucas scrambled backward, trying to crawl under the table. Sienna covered her head, debris raining down around her. She felt a strong hand grab the back of her Kevlar vest and haul her up. "Move!" Brian yelled, firing over her shoulder to suppress a gunman behind a forklift. He dragged her behind a stack of concrete barriers. The firefight was short and brutal. Brian's men were professionals. The Russians were thugs. Within 60 seconds, silence returned to the warehouse, heavy and ringing. "Clear!" Matteo shouted from the catwalk. Brian holstered his weapon and turned to Sienna. He cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Are you hurt?" "No," she breathed, adrenaline coursing through her. "I'm fine." "Good." Brian turned. "Bring him out." 2 of Brian's guards dragged a sobbing Lucas from under the table and threw him onto the concrete floor at Brian's feet. Lucas looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Dom, please. I didn't know. They forced me. Sienna, tell him. Tell him I love you." Sienna stepped out from behind Brian. She looked down at the man she had wasted 2 years of her life on. He looked small, pathetic, and utterly devoid of honor. "You don't love anyone, Lucas," Sienna said quietly. "You just love money." She turned to Brian. "I don't want to see him anymore." Brian nodded. "Take him away. The police will find him with the evidence of his embezzlement in the morning, and ensure he has a very difficult time in prison." "No, Sienna!" Lucas screamed as he was dragged out into the night. The door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. Sienna stood alone in the center of the warehouse with the most dangerous man in Chicago. The dust was settling. The danger was over. Brian walked over to her. He took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering the tactical vest. "It's done," he said. "The Russians are finished in this city. Lucas is gone. You can go back to your life, Sienna. I'll clear your name. You can forget this ever happened." Sienna looked up at him. She looked at the blood on his shirt, the scar on his brow, and the intense, dark eyes that had watched over her when the world tried to break her. She thought about her old life, the boring architectural drafts, the lonely nights, the boyfriend who didn't care. Then she thought about the way she felt right now. Alive. Powerful. Protected. She reached out and took hold of his lapels, pulling him down to her level. "I don't want to forget," she whispered. Brian's eyes widened slightly. "Sienna, you don't know what you're asking. My world is darkness." "Then let me be the light," she said. "Or let me be the fire." "I don't care. Just don't send me away." Brian searched her face for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the moment she sent that photo. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "You sent a photo to the devil, Sienna," he growled low in his throat. "And he answered," she replied. He kissed her then, a searing, possessive kiss that tasted of danger and promise. It wasn't the kiss of a client and an architect. It was the kiss of a king and his queen. Outside, the Chicago wind howled, but inside, Sienna Brooks was finally home. That is the story of how one wrong number changed everything. Sienna Brooks thought her life was over when she hit send. But sometimes, the biggest mistakes lead us to exactly where we are supposed to be. She went from designing buildings to ruling an empire, proving that sometimes you have to burn your old life down to build something stronger from the ashes. What about you? If you accidentally sent a risky photo to a dangerous stranger, would you have the courage to face him like Sienna did, or would you run? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of romance, danger, and betrayal, please smash that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a bad boy with a heart of gold, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching.